Welcome, everybody. I'm just fascinated watching all your introductions scroll by the screen. I see some familiar names. I see names of a lot of AmeriCorps volunteers, which is pretty typical for this session. So I just want to welcome you all. I'm flattered and delighted that you've chosen to spend an hour or so with me today talking about grant writing. I've been teaching this class for the past, I think, 5 years now for the Governor's Conference on Volunteerism. And I'm used to being in a classroom where I can see your faces and react to you. So this is a new experience for me. Bear with me, and hopefully you'll learn a few things, and hopefully I can answer any questions that you might have. Just to tell you a little bit about me, as Michaela said, I am the Director of Development at the Capitol Center for the Arts. I have been there for 15 years. And prior to that, I served as the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Writers Project for 5 years and the Director of Development at the New Hampshire Humanities Council for 7 years prior to that. I've been working in nonprofits pretty steadily for over 30 years since I got out of college. I fell into this world. I think a lot of people do. I don't think there are a lot of people that leave college with a shiny degree and say they want to raise money for a living, and we all sort of fall into it in some way or another. But it's been a really rewarding community to be a part of, and I'm glad to be sharing it with you today. So usually I team teach this with my friend Cassie Mason, who's the grants officer for the New Hampshire State Council for the Arts. She has up to her ears in CARES funding and a lot of things thrown at her. So she's unable to be with us today. So I will try to do her portion of the presentation justice. Thank you for answering the poll questions. This is really enlightening to me. It looks like we're pretty well split on a sort of almost a 65-35 kind of split between people who've never written a grant before and people who've gotten at least one grant funded before, and then a few of you have written a grant but you haven't gotten the funding. So that's really helpful for me to know where you're coming to this from, and also the size of the shop and your role within that shop. So thank you very much for doing that. I'm just gonna slide that poll over to the right so it's out of my way. So I'm gonna sort of go through this. I think we have an agenda that Michaela's gonna share on the screen and should have been sent to you as well. I'm gonna try to just walk you through the process of grant writing and from start to finish. And I'm gonna try to stop at the end of each section and ask for questions. But if a question comes up and you don't want to wait for me to say, are there any questions, please do enter it in the Q&A feature that Michaela spoke about earlier. And Leslie and Michaela will make sure that those get to me. So usually this is where I say, how many of you have heard from the chairman of your board or a trustee or your executive director, hey, you can get us a grant for that, right? That's a very common way that we fall into grant writing, and it's often not the best way to fall into it, but we all live with it. And so I'm going to help you kind of walk yourself through this process of from researching your funder to writing the final report, and hopefully you'll leave with some pretty concrete tools. I'm going to flip-flop the numbers on the first section on preparing your grant proposal first. And I'm going to talk first about defining your project. Before you even start to research your funder, really know what it is you want funding for. Really have a good idea of whether it's a new project, whether it's an existing project that you want to take to a different level or bring to a different group of your constituents. It could be, and it probably is in these COVID-19 days, operating support, and that's okay. But it's just really important that you know what it is you're asking the funder to fund. And that sounds very simple and it sounds very basic, and you'd be amazed how many people don't start there because knowing your project is going to help you find the right funder for it. So you've got your project, maybe it's operating support, maybe it's, you know, a brand new project for your organization, and you think you've found the right funder. And at the end of the workshop, I'm going to give you a list of some resources and places you can go to research foundations that might be a good fit for you. But for this moment in time, we're going to suppose that you've landed on a foundation you think might be a right fit. In New Hampshire, the likelihood that that will be the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation is pretty strong. They are the biggest funder in the state, and they have the widest reach. So chances are your first forays into grant funding may start with the Charitable Foundation. And that's not a bad place to start. They have really great staff and really accessible staff. But it may start there, it may start at the Arts Council, it may start with a Health and Human Services related foundation. But wherever it starts, you need to take some time to step back and research that funder. And that really means everything. Read their annual reports. Look at the size of gifts they've given out. If you have a $75,000 project and you look at your funder and their average grant award is $5,000, you know you've got some ground to make up. And so it's very important that you're positioning your ask within the realm of that funder's historical giving. If you represent, you know, an environmental group and you look at all of the grants that this funder has funded recently and you see only schools and libraries, probably not going to be a good fit for you. Not impossible, but at least you're going to go into this knowing you have a little bit of that uphill climb in front of you. Some foundations will say things like broad support of education, and then when you look at the organizations they fund, you'll realize that it's the alma maters of all the trustees. So maybe they're not going to fund, you know, the after-school program at your local elementary school. So this is where research is really going to benefit you tremendously as you move through this. Most foundations will tell you that the reason a request gets turned down is because it doesn't align with their priorities. And so taking this time up front is going to save you a lot of time and a lot of tears on the other end of things if you can make sure you're aligning with what that funder needs. Foundations have very public information. You can usually find them online. You can find them at a site called GuideStar, which will often show you what they've funded in the past. That's where you're going to find the devil in the details. That's where you're going to really find the fine print of the types of grants they get and the amount of those grants. Usually you'll be able to find on those websites deadlines and sample grant proposal formats. Really look at those fine print. Make sure you know their deadlines. Make sure you know what kind of a format they're using. Most foundations are using an online format now, but a lot of small private foundations still want you to mail a packet into them. Make sure you look at the kind of attachments they want. I found it very helpful to have a folder on my desktop, which is common attachments. And you kind of have to stay on top of them. You have to really update them every year. And those will be things like your 501c3 letter. If you're big enough to have audited financials, it would be your most recent audit. If you're small enough that you don't get audited, you probably want to have your most recent fiscal year's budget to actuals. You want to have, in the state of New Hampshire, you get asked a lot for your certificate of good standing, which is something you can get from the Secretary of State's office very easily for $5. So it's just really helpful to have those things sort of at the ready, because the last thing you want to be doing when you're on a deadline is scrambling for those attachments that you didn't realize you have. But foundations love to throw you curveballs too and ask for attachments you didn't see coming. So, you know, this is the moment you want to really take that time to look through those. As you're researching your funder, write a list of questions you have and then if you feel that this is something you want to move to a telephone call, you want to try to talk to a program officer about, you're going to be prepared, you're going to be ready, you're not going to be fumbling. It's easy to get nervous when you're calling somebody you don't know. I mean, I'm nervous now, just sort of talking to my screen. So I'm, I stumble over my words a little bit, and I've been doing this a long time. But I think, if you've got that set of questions, almost a script you're going to follow, you're going to be in a much better spot, and you'll be able to move through a phone call to your funder. A lot of foundations will welcome a call from you. Some don't. Some of the larger foundations will have a series of gatekeepers, but most of them really do want to hear from you. And I think the thing to remember is, these foundations want you to succeed. They want to give their money away. They don't want to keep it. They have to give a certain amount away every year, especially if it's a federal agency like an arts council. So they want you to succeed, and they are going to be your partner in helping you succeed. Don't see them as this gate you have to climb over. I mean, really approach this as, they're going to be on your side, because I think they are. I've worked with a lot of foundations in my day, and I really have only come across one where I felt that they kind of didn't really ever want to give any of their money away. What I like to do is figure out, you can sometimes tell from the website who the best person to call is. The Charitable Foundation is great about that. They have their program officers organized by geographic regions. Other foundations that may be harder to find, I like to send an email, an introductory email first, saying who I am, who I represent, and that I was wondering if I could get 15 minutes of their time to just talk over some questions I had about their proposal process. And that's usually the best way to start this, and it can get set up fairly quickly. Some of the larger foundations have gatekeepers who will schedule for their program officers. But in New Hampshire, especially at the foundation, they're very accessible and really happy to hear from you and talk to you. If they say on their website, and some of them will, do not call us, send us a letter of inquiry, abide by that. Like the surest way to get off on the wrong foot is to call somebody who has said, please do not call me. So make sure you're looking for that too. And if they've asked for a letter of inquiry, send a letter of inquiry. Like, do it the way they've asked you to do it. And that's going to go a long way towards putting you in a good standing with them. So, you've made your list of questions, and you've made your call, or you're on the phone with your program officer. And make sure you have your kind of elevator pitch about your organization. Not all program officers know all of our organizations. I mean, we eat, sleep, breathe them. We can't imagine there are people who haven't heard of us, but there are. So make sure you have that sort of quick little pitch of who you are, what your role is within the organization, and then those questions about the funding process. The most important thing to do then is to sort of shut up and listen. And it's hard to do when we're nervous. It's hard to do when we're excited. It's hard to do when we feel this is the greatest project in the world and we just can't wait to tell somebody about it because we know they're going to give us a lot of money. But it's really important, because this is when you're going to find those clues and those things that the foundation officer is going to tell you that's going to help your proposal be even stronger. Oftentimes they'll give you tips. Sometimes they'll give you wording advice. Really important to listen to that. Those are ways they're trying to help you succeed. So if the program officer says to you, wow, this is a really neat project. I think for our foundation, we'd love you to focus on the part of it that serves, new immigrant and refugee arrivals to the community. Do that. Don't then go off and send a proposal in that ignores what her advice or his advice was, because those are really important tips and ways they want you to succeed. So listening is a huge part of the process, as it is in all fundraising, right? If we don't listen to our donors and our patrons, then we don't succeed. Be ready for the funder to ask you how you plan to sustain the project. If it's a new project, they're going to want to know how you're going to keep it going after their initial year of funding. And they will often ask you that on the phone. So that's a question you kind of really want to be ready to answer, and just have that sort of in your back pocket. And then once you're done, try to keep it brief, try to respect their time. Always send a follow-up thank you email to them, thanking them for your time. This is how you establish relationships. I've been here a really long time, and I'm at the point in my career that I can call pretty much any program officer at the Charitable Foundation or the Arts Council or the Fidelity Foundation or the Hearst Foundation and ask them a question. But I've gotten there by building those relationships, and those relationships get built on thank you emails and follow-up emails. And sometimes I'll shoot them a quick email as I'm getting close to the end, like, thanks again for all your help, our proposal's almost done, you should see it next week. That goes a long way towards cementing yourself in their head. I had a mentor when I first started working in New Hampshire, who some of you may remember, a wonderful man named Pat Jackson, and he was a PR guy, and he's since passed away, but he used to say that you want to make yourself part of people's mental furniture. And what he meant by that was, when you walk into your house, you don't have to say, oh, there's my couch, there's my dining room table, there's my refrigerator. You know they're there. You know what they look like. You know the purpose they serve. Cementing these relationships is going to make you part of their mental furniture, and it's going to keep you and your organization kind of in the upper part of their mind. So this is all of that kind of legwork you're going to do before you even write a word of your proposal. So I'm going to just pause there, take a drink of water, and see if we have any questions so far.
Hey, Katie, Alan here. I do have a few questions for you. Is there a national database for funders?
Yes. One of the handouts that you got has a list of grant writing websites and resources. There's some great sites on there, Associated Grant Makers, GuideStar is wonderful, grants.gov is wonderful, Chronicle of Philanthropy has some, the New Hampshire Division of Charitable Trust has an amazing list, which I'll get to later. A lot of it takes some digging because they're not always up to date. But in New England, I have found it more helpful to look at regional databases like Associated Grantmakers of New England. But GuideStar is a fantastic resource, and that's helped me out tremendously.
Awesome. Are most grants specific for specific programming, or are there some for just general operation needs?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The answer is yes and yes. More and more, we are seeing some funders really invest in operating support. The Charitable Foundation has really taken the lead on that here in New Hampshire. Other funders like the Fidelity Foundation or the Hearst Foundation can be program specific, but those programs can include a healthy amount of operating expenses, which I'll get to when I talk about budgeting. Primarily, I still see it project focused, but I think that tide is turning. So you can find both, and there's also ways to get some of your operating costs covered, even if it's a project-based grant. So I'll go over that in the budget.
Awesome. In that initial 15-minute kind of meeting with your funder, what kind of questions would you suggest people ask, or what kind of examples of questions?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it really depends on your project. I always start by saying, this is who I am, and this is what the Capital Center is about. and this is our project that we have, but I wanted to learn a little bit more about your foundation and to see if this might be a good fit. That's a great phrase to use because it really sort of opens things up for the funder to talk. And that's when you really want to listen. That conversation will usually lead you to the kind of questions you're going to ask them. You might say, okay, so in this project, I'm going to make up some examples, but the funder might say, we really want to focus on, serving children who have come here from through immigrant families or refugee families and are struggling, in school. And so we're really trying to focus on programs that serve them. And you might say, okay, that sounds great. Our program is actually arts-based, but we'd like to bring it to to this existing after-school program that you're already funding. I'm just making things up here, but
Mhm.
as you listen to them talk about their funding, you want to be getting ready for your next question, to ask them. Just keep reiterating your project. And wow, do you think that you'd be interested in funding that whole project or a piece of that project? Sometimes the questions will be budgetary in nature. You definitely should ask them, can we include some operating support in our project budget? I would ask them what kind of reporting requirements they have if you're not sure about that, because that's the last piece of the grant cycle. But, I think the questions you're going to ask are going to come out of your research into the foundation itself. So if the foundation's website is kind of vague and it says, we accept grants anytime, you might want to say, okay, I see you accept grants anytime. How often do you meet to review grants? Because that's going to help you figure out when you might hear and when you want to try to get your grant in. It's, the questions are going to be specific to you and your project. So it's hard for me to sort of give you these 3 or 4 questions to ask them. But the biggest thing you're calling about is you're playing matchmaker to see if your project or your organization fits with their funding priorities.
Perfect. I have 2 more if you're okay
Sure.
with that. One of them, and we might answer this later, but I'm not sure. The issue of the sustainability
Mm-hmm.
question, like how do you keep something sustainable?
Right.
Do you have any tips for that kind of issue?
That's really an issue for your organization to grapple with. And sometimes it's okay to say, we don't have all the answers yet when you're talking to a funder. But you never want to put all your eggs in one funder's basket. So I would say to them, what I try to say is we've got some corporate sponsorship requests out around this project that we hope will renew each year. There's a small fee to come to this project, and that's going to sustain the admin costs each year. The answers can be simple, but it's also okay to say, we have an idea, but as we move through this first year of the project, that idea might change and we might refine it. And that's legitimate. I kind of always advocate for honesty over pretending that you've got all the answers. I think that's generally more respected because life and projects don't unfold in a neat pattern the way we want them to. So I hope that answered your question.
And then this one, we'll let you do one more before we keep
Sure.
going. Uh, in that kind of age-old conundrum of, you need so much experience to get the job, but how do you get the experience? For grant writing positions, how would you suggest going about getting the experience in grant writing if you can't get a job in that field without experience?
Oh, okay. So in other words, you want to try to get a job as a grant writer, but you've never written any grants. One of the best ways you could do that is by volunteering. And so if there's an organization that you're involved in, and that could be anything, it could be your PTA, it could be your church, it could be, the friends of whatever hospital is in your area. But if it's an organization that's really all volunteer based and you're thinking about writing a grant for that, um, give that a shot. Do it as a volunteer. there's no, I'm always fascinated by grant writing positions because there's no magic bullet. I mean, grant writing is not mysterious. It really isn't. It's just being a good writer, which I'm going to talk about in the next section, and having a good project and being able to connect with people. It's there's no jargon or lingo that, they don't tell you until you get into the grant writing club. I mean, it's just good English and a good project. Um, so my feeling is if you're a good writer and you're sort of fearless about picking up the phone, go apply for those jobs and make your case for it and offer to give them writing samples because I've seen professional grant writers and grant writing positions who are terrible writers. So the best thing you can do is just work on your writing and make your writing stronger and just go for it. Especially if it's an organization that you're kind of passionate about. If you love hiking and the Appalachian Mountain Club is looking for a grant writer, go apply, because I would 100 times rather hire somebody who understands our world and the work we do that I can teach grant writing to than a really awesome grant writer who doesn't understand the world I work in. So I wouldn't let that hold you back.
Awesome. Thank you.
So I'm going to move on to the next section, which is writing the grant, which is my favorite. I like to call it procrastinating the writing of the grant. That's my personal approach to things. Or as I like to say, writing it in my head for a week before I sit down. So you've talked to the program officer, you think your project is a good fit or your organization is a good fit. You have the outline of the grant proposal and you're ready to write. A lot of grants will be online and they'll have their questions out. I like to go into the online portal and copy the questions and paste them into a Word document and just work in that because I've been burned too many times by things I thought saved that didn't. So that's one of my first tips to you. The first thing I do is I read the entire narrative of questions. I read everything and really make sure I understand what they're asking. And narrative questions can be really funny, and don't always assume, especially if it's a funder you're going back to for the second year, they love to change the narrative questions on you. So don't assume that they're always going to be the same. I like to read through them all. I like to highlight key points that I want to really punch. And sometimes I just start freehand outlining how I'm going to do it. I'm going to put this in this section and this in this section. But I keep those narrative questions in front of me the whole time I'm writing, so I don't get off track. And also, so that I can kind of move things around. I see sometimes a narrative like a puzzle, and I just submitted a proposal that asked two almost identical questions. One was sort of about your role in the community, and one was about your community impact. And I spent the better part of last week moving things from one section to another and changing my mind and moving them back. So when I'm doing that in Word, it's much easier than when I'm doing it within the grant portal. I highly recommend doing your work in Word first. If you are, I know a lot of you said you are small shops, 5 people or less. I was a one-person shop for the first 3 years of my career. So I always like to say my title was executive director. It could have been, janitor, because I cleaned the office also. So I get it. If you're a small shop, this next point may not apply to you. But if you have enough of an organization that you've got a group of people who are responsible for different aspects of your work, it's really good sometimes to divide up some of these questions. I don't know if any of you have ever applied for Community Development Finance Authority tax credits. I know at least one of you has, Brian. I know you're out there. A lot of that narrative had to do with our facilities, our buildings, our energy usage, things that are not my area of expertise. So I gave them to our director of facilities and production, who really oversees all of our buildings. And I said, and he's not a writer at all, but I said, I need some words. I need some language to go in here. Just throw words there. I'll make it pretty. I'll make it good sentences. I'll put it all together, but I need the words from you. So if it makes sense, divide up the work, give your colleagues some time together to do that. Sit down with them and say, can the finance person write this piece of it? Can the executive director write this piece of it? Can the director of production write this piece of it? That's just my organization I'm using as an example. That really helps it feel less overwhelming at times. And then I just start to tackle it one section at a time. And I love to do the easiest section first. And the easiest section, I can guarantee you, will be your organizational history. It's going to be some version of your organizational history, your mission, and your, key achievements. There's always some version of that that's like the first question they ask you. I like to have that in my grant folders on my desktop, just ready to go. And then I can plunk it in there and I can tweak it a little for the funder that I'm talking to. But then I feel this great sense of accomplishment because I've started the grant and I've written this section on it. And psychologically, do not underestimate what that will do for you, because it's quite wonderful. And then, as you're plowing through it, these are things to keep in mind. Word counts and character counts, especially if the foundation is using an online portal. They will often limit your answers. 500 words is very common, or you might see it 2,000 characters. Make sure if they are counting words or counting characters, because I got burned so badly one year when I thought it was words and it was characters, and it was a mess. It was awful. We got through it, but it was my own fault because I hadn't paid attention. So really make a point to know if they're limiting your word count on any of these. If they're not limiting your word count, that's great, but don't abuse it. You try to be succinct, try to get to the point. Don't ramble on and on and on, because I always try to put myself in the role of the funder and know what they have to read and how many of these they're going to have to read. When you're writing, there's a couple of tips that will make your writing stronger. The single greatest thing you can do to look like a stronger writer than you may think you are is to write in the active voice. And what that means is, try to avoid sentences that use any version of is, am, are, will. That's okay. You're going to have some of that in there. But you really want to try to make your sentences as active as possible. Instead of saying the Capital Center for the Arts is a leader in performing arts organizations, you might say the Capital Center for the Arts leads the performing arts landscape in New Hampshire by. Just try to make it active, because it's just going to make, I call it like it sits up and pays attention a little bit more. It doesn't seem as passive. And it's just a really easy tip. Included in your handouts is a list of some amazing, great active verbs. Some of my favorites are on there. Don't go crazy. You don't want to look like a freshman comp major with a thesaurus. You want to use good, clear language. But that tip can really bump your writing up a notch, especially if you're sort of not confident in your writing. It's a really easy trick to learn how to do. Really avoid jargon. I live, breathe, eat, sleep the world of theater, but I know people reading my grant aren't going to. So I try really hard not to use theater inside terms. I try not to use acronyms. If you use an acronym, write the full name out first and then acronym the parentheses, and then you can refer to it that way going forward. But your reader does not know what you know. Your reader doesn't know all of the ins and outs of running a conservation organization or a homeless shelter or a theater or an after-school program. So don't assume they know insider jargon that you know. If you're going to use that jargon, just define it, just define what it means, so they know what you're talking about. Because it's a really easy way to alienate somebody reading the organization, the grant, if they have to sort of look up what you're talking about. Be really specific. Don't talk in generalities. You've got time, you've had time presumably to think of this project. Be specific about it. Back up anecdotes with data. Anecdotes are great. I mean, I live and die on anecdotes, but I want them backed up with some data. And they are more effective if for example, you can say, it's wonderful when we have a show at the Capitol Center because the local pizza shop will call us and find out how many tickets we've sold so he knows what kind of a crowd to be ready for. That's great. That's a great anecdote. But it's better if then you can back that up by saying, this bears out the data of a recent study that performing arts attendees spend between $17 and $49 per person in the community above and beyond the price of their ticket when they go to a show. So that's impressive. Now you've put a human face on it and you've backed it up with data. So whatever your organization is, find those facts and figures, really work to get those and then put a human face on them, because that's gonna help your narrative. If you're serving at-risk girls in the Lakes region, find a human story for it and then back it up with, Abby is representative of the 52% girls in our program who, blah, blah, whatever the story is. So these are all things that are going to make your project stand out. I was just a grant reader for a round of Arts Council grants, and I was astonished how unspecific so many of them were about the project and who they were going to help. So take that time, gather that data, gather those. If somebody just in talking, or you get a letter from somebody who loved your program and they wrote you a thank you, save that, use that, put that in a grant. I was on the phone this morning with a corporate sponsor who said to me, your theater for me is a place of sanctuary and peace. And I wrote it down and I said to him, that's beautiful and it's going in my next grant. Always be having your ear to the ground and looking for those stories that will put a human face on your proposal, because that's going to really make your proposal pop. Ask, before I get to proofreading, the last section of the proposal is always, how are you going to measure success? How are you going to evaluate it? I can guarantee you that will be the last question on every grant that you write. It's tempting to save last. It's often the hardest question to answer. So I try to answer it first so I get it out of the way. It's like my reward for writing the rest of the grant if I've written the evaluation section. But be specific, really be specific. Don't just say, we're going to come up with a survey and we'll send it to people. I mean, okay, I guess you could say that, but talk about what's going to be on that survey, and we're going to ask them. And if they come back and 50% of the people who responded to the survey said this, or this, we'll know we've done our job. Don't, be really specific how you want to measure your success. It doesn't have to be long. They just want to know you've got a plan and that you're gonna pay attention to how the year went, how the program went, how the show went, whatever it is, and that you're going to learn from it and they'll make the next time better. There's often a narrative section about your budget, or there'll be a section in the beginning saying, what are you asking for? Make sure that number matches the number in your attached budget, 100%, because, and I'm guilty of this. I'm guilty. I think Leslie from Volunteer New Hampshire will tell you, I was guilty of it in the last grant I wrote to Volunteer New Hampshire in April, because we had changed our budget numbers. And I had done it on the attached budget sheet, and I'd forgotten to go back into the narrative and say, we're requesting X amount of dollars. So I get a call from Leslie saying, your budget says this and your narrative says this, and what are you really asking for? So we all do it. And the irony of the person that Volunteer New Hampshire hires to teach grant writing, having that happen to her, was not lost on me. So, definitely pay attention to those kind of things so that all of your pieces are saying the same thing to each other. Once you have written it, once you've got a good first draft in and you've spell checked it and everybody's given you their sections and the word counts are fine, give it to somebody who knows nothing about your project and have them proofread it. At the Capitol Center, I routinely gave every grant I wrote to a woman who worked in our box office part-time because she was the best proofreader ever. She would find all of my mistakes, but she would also come back and say, I don't understand this section. What are you saying here? So those outside voices are really going to help you, and they're going to help you fix errors, and they're going to help you make your case stronger. So whether it's a person within your organization or whether it's a volunteer or a trustee, somebody you really trust, have them read this proposal and give it a really, really, really good proof. Make sure your board knows that you're putting in this proposal. In New Hampshire, it's a very small state. Our trustees know a lot of other trustees who sit on boards of foundations. And so it's not unusual for them to maybe get a question, even in casual social passing. Oh yeah, Jim, you're on the board of Child and Family Services, and yeah, we've got one of those grants coming before us this year. If Jim doesn't know you've put that grant in, he can be scrambling. So make sure your board knows. Make sure your board knows what you're doing and where you're sending these grants in for consideration. And then double check all your attachments. Make sure they're all there. Upload them if it's an online portal. Copy them if it's a mailed in application. You can also see sometimes they'll say you can attach anything else you think we might like to see. Try not to take that as an invitation to attach all of your promotional materials. Pick one or two really good things. It might be a newspaper article about your organization. It might be your last annual report. It might be a brochure. But those are nice things to have on hand to send along with these proposals. So I'm going to stop there for a second because I've thrown a whole lot at you about writing, and see if you have some questions on this part of things.
Perfect. How much time do you normally spend on the grant application? On one of them, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I spend a lot more time thinking about it, walking around thinking about it, than I do writing it. And I realized that kind of works for me. I sort of write it in my head for a couple of days. There's no kind of right or wrong answer to this. The proposal I'm sending in today, I started writing last week, but I didn't only write that. I write it in here and there. Sometimes I can sit down and work on a grant for a whole day, but I usually can't. I usually have other things I have to do. So my key is usually compartmentalizing and just saying to myself, this morning is going to be all about that grant. And then the afternoon I'll work on something else. I don't think there's a template for how many hours you want to spend on a grant. It's going to depend on the kind of writer you are. And what else is on your plate. I mean, grant writing is not the only thing on any of our plates. So, you've got to kind of know your own job. But for me, it helps to just really compartmentalize that and to say to people that I work with, I'm not dealing with anything else today but this grant. So don't ask me any other questions. But it usually, I tend to work on grants in kind of 2-week chunks, and a week of that is kind of walking around thinking about it and jotting notes down, and then a week of that is writing it, and then there's like a good solid day of attachments. So that's kind of how I get there.
This may be in the handouts that you provided, but
Sure.
What are some sites that people can look at for strong examples of grants that have been written?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm not sure. That's a question I have to honestly say I'm not sure, because I've never gone out and kind of looked for sample grants. But you might, in your conversations with your funders, say, do you have a grant that was really well done, that you could share with me, or that's a legitimate question to ask. um, you can certainly, you can Google anything these days. But what somebody thinks is a great written grant isn't necessarily going to be a greatly written grant. So I think it sort of comes down to funder preferences. So it's legitimate to ask your funder, do you have a sample of something that was really sharp that I could look at? That's especially a great question to ask if you don't get funded. Like, I'd love you to show me what a good funded grant looks like, and if they can, I'm sure they will.
Awesome. I have two others. One of them is more specifically geared towards AmeriCorps, and I might just read it verbatim because
Sure.
it's easier that way. The bizarre thing about our AmeriCorps grant is that we compete each year. So even though we have existed for years, we're competing as a new program each year.
Okay.
Um, and they they don't. I think they meant to write. They don't like us referencing previous grants by completing. Hmm. Yeah, I guess they're saying if they've existed for a while, but they have to keep pitching it as a new thing, right, and not reusing the
Right.
terminology from before. Um,
Hi.
how, yeah, how can you accurately provide data under those restrictions? And I don't pretend to be a master of AmeriCorps grants, but
Yeah, no, that's a tough one. I'm not at all. So I think I understand you, that you're not sort of supposed to repeat yourself from year to year. That's almost an impossible thing to do. I think, there if I think you still have to kind of go at it, even if you're changing up your language a little bit, and keep it very brief. Um, but if they're asking, I'm not familiar with the narrative questions they ask on AmeriCorps. Um, but if they're asking about things like your track record of success, you're going to have to be able to reference what you got funding for the prior year. I would be happy offline, so we don't take everybody's time. And at the end of the session, I think Michaela is going to share my contact information with you all. I would be happy if you wanted to email me and give me some examples of what those grants look like. I think I might be able to be a better help to you, because I'm just not familiar with that funding piece of things. But I'd be happy to talk to you offline and see if I can help.
awesome. The only other question I have is a an existential one, or more of a full philosophical one, about the grant process in general. So, do you feel that the process of grants, people having money, people applying for grants, and then the money going to those who write the best grants, is an effective system?
Wow, that's deep. I think, you know, I think it's the best system we have, and I have to say it's gotten a lot better. Um, Fundamentally, you have to have a good project or a good organization that fits with the guidelines of that funder. I really like to approach grants as um, as knowing that they want you to succeed. They really want you to get this money. When you flip that narrative in your head, I think it starts to make a difference. Grants are not something you can build your whole budget on. They're just not. They should be a very small piece of your contributed income budget, because they're unreliable. They can change from year to year. They're not always renewable. And so you don't want to put all those eggs in that basket. But I also don't think you want to approach it with this thought that there's this, fortress of money, that Scrooge McDuck is sitting on, and he's only going to give it to people who say the right words. I think that's changed. I think it's changed a lot. I think that funders are more accessible and they are more understanding about how nonprofits work. And it really can change with your program officers. I had a program officer at the Fidelity Foundation that almost years ago, I just thought I will never, ever get it right with him. Like, I just couldn't not find the words I felt he was looking for. I couldn't, I just felt like I never got there. I never got close enough. And then he retired, and the people that have had that job since then could not be more different. And all of a sudden, the Fidelity Foundation loves me. I was writing the same things. It was just the people changed. So, that's why it kind of is really helpful to get to know your foundation staff as people, if you can. Um, you know, Existentially, is this the greatest measure of how we raise money? Maybe not. But raising money as a system always will be of organizations that need it, asking it of people and businesses and foundations that have it. And there's always going to be a power imbalance. That's the nature of the beast. The way you will succeed is to not see that as an adversarial relationship, but to see it as a partnership. And if you can really get that sort of narrative flipped in your head, I think you'll see it makes a difference in your work and in your writing and in your programs.
Perfect. Those were all the questions that were there.
All right. Thank you. Feel free to, like, in chat or whatever, tell me to slow down, because I do tend to talk fast when I get nervous. So it's the New Englander in me. So now we're going to talk about budgeting. And this is the section that Cassie has always done when we've presented this. And I've always sort of taken a break and had a drink of water and eaten a mini Snickers bar. So I'm going to try to do her justice by going through this budgeting breakdown. Budgeting for me is my Achilles heel. I am a writer. I am not a numbers person. I'm a writer to the point that I think in words. If you say the word tree to me, I literally see TREE. I do not see a picture of a tree. So budgeting is, for me, always the part that gives me a little agita. But the way I've attacked it is by knowing who within my organization can help me. And in my organization, it's our director of finance or our assistant executive director. It's going to be very different. In your organization, it may be the treasurer of the board if you don't have a finance director. It may just be somebody in your office who's really good with numbers. But if numbers aren't your thing, the single greatest thing you can do is find somebody who is good with numbers who will help you through this process. The biggest thing to do is to understand the terminology that a funder is using. So funders will have sometimes quirky ways of asking the same information. This is where it's also really helpful to have established a relationship with your program officer, because if you can say in that initial meeting, if I have some questions as I'm working through the budget, can I email or call you? And they will, they will be there for you. I mean, I spent a lot of time on the phone with Leslie on this last grant that I wrote for Volunteer New Hampshire, and am indebted to her help in getting me through the budget section, because I've written a lot of budgets, and this one was very, very different from anything I'd ever done. And so I needed some help with the terminology. But basically, your budget is going to look at a couple of things. If you're writing an operating grant, if you're applying to the Charitable Foundation or the Arts Council for operating support, chances are you're just going to pull those numbers from your operating budget, or in some cases just attach the operating budget. But some, even if it's an operating grant, they may want you to take your operating budget and then shoehorn it into their budget form. And that can take a little, numeric gymnastics to make happen. But it's really going to be looking at your revenues and your direct expenses and your indirect expenses. So revenues are anything you make from this project, or if it's an operating grant that you make as an organization. So in the case of a theater, it's ticket fees, it's tickets, it's ticket fees, it's concessions, it's individual gifts, membership, etc. All of that goes into your revenue. You always want to give them a balanced budget where the revenue and the expenses sort of match. If it's a program that you're running, it'll be reflected specific to that program, whether there's a fee to attend, or whether, you're going to sell, soft drinks at or whatever, put that in your revenue for the budget. And it may be there's no revenue for a budget. A lot of social service organizations will have projects that have no revenue to them, and that's okay. Direct expenses are things like program staff time specific to this project. So if you have a marketing director and they're going to spend, 1 day a week working on this project, promoting this project, you can take a fifth of their time and put it into that budget, a fifth of their salary and benefits. It could be if you have to buy supplies, if you have to print posters, if you have to mail things, if you have to travel somewhere, if you have to buy certain equipment. And some funders will allow equipment, some won't. This is where that conversation is going to come in handy with them. If you have to rent a facility for this project to happen, that's a direct expense. Indirect expenses are generally overhead based, the kind of expenses that come with running the organization while you're doing this project. And that can be everything from salary and benefits to your telephone bill and your internet bill and your lighting bill and your heating bill and all of those things. So funders may not pay for that, but they may have a section where they want to see that and how this program fits. It gives them a picture of how this program fits in the overall landscape of your organization. In-kind expenses and revenue is also a really good part of this. In-kind can be anything from, donated pizzas for your volunteers to, we have our lawyers donate a certain dollar amount of legal time every year to us, or it could be somebody's donating, the postage for your invitations, whatever it is. But you want to definitely include those in that as well. Volunteer time absolutely is good, and I think Leslie and Michaela would know, but I think there's a pretty standard way to calculate the value of volunteer time that's kind of consistent across the board. But don't spread yourself too thin with the in-kind stuff either. Make sure you have a backup way to pay for some of these things. Try not to stack it so much with in-kind. The funders are looking for a balanced, realistic budget. And more I'm seeing funders really streamline their budget forms, and they're much more simple than they used to be. So, you want to just, in my organization, I'm not the person sometimes who has those numbers. So I go to the people who have them. If you're the person who has those numbers, my hat's off to you. It's never been my game. And then you want to see if there's a budget narrative. And I really love budget narratives because numbers sometimes don't tell the whole story. I mean, we just came off of a huge multi-year capital campaign that raised $6.9 million. So when you look at our audit from fiscal year 2019, it looks like we're just rolling in millions of dollars, but all of that money is restricted to this facility that we just built. So the narrative section gives you time to explain that. And oftentimes it'll either be a narrative question built into the grant narrative itself, or you can sort of add notes to the budget spreadsheet itself, which explains, this is tied up in endowment, or this is tied up in, paying off the mortgage for this new building, or whatever it is. So make sure that you can talk about the numbers too. I'm notorious for saying to our finance director, just put the numbers in so I can finish it, because I hate talking about numbers. But I know that I could get a call from a program officer saying, yeah, I've got a question about your budget. So you've got to be ready to talk about them too. So when I sit with our director of finance and I ask her to give me these numbers, I also really ask her to explain how she got them, where they came from, what they mean. And then that helps me be able to defend it, because I'm the person that's going to get called if there's a question. So some very common errors on the budget. We've already talked about having a different number in the narrative than you have on the budget attachment. Very, very common as we change the proposal as we work through it. So just always make sure if you update one, you update the other, that they have to match. That's the single biggest, most common budget mistake people make. Or that your revenue and expenses are wildly off. Most funders are going to look for those to match up in a certain way. That your calculations are somehow wrong, that things don't add up. You've got a formula that's wonky in there. Just really go over and double check that. You want to have somebody who's good with numbers proofread your budget the way you had somebody proofread your narrative. That there's enough detail there that or that your budget covers the time period you're asking them to fund, like the time matches up with them. Those are all very common, easily made mistakes, but easily fixed ones too. So as you review things, as you look at your budget, think of them with that in mind. And then, before you hit submit, which is still terrifying to me sometimes when I'm working in an online portal. Sometimes I miss the days of running across the parking lot at the Charitable Foundation at 4:59 on a Friday to drop my proposal off. But before you hit submit, review your budget the same way you reviewed your proposal. Is it consistent with the narrative? Does the budget tell the financial story of the project that you've written about? Does it balance? Are unclear items explained? Have you included in-kind revenue and expenses? Have you explained what pieces are overhead costs? Is it realistic? Does it make sense? Is the funder going to look at this and say, you're never going to achieve this in 1 year? Don't aim too high with what you think it can do. And has somebody else reviewed it? Never let it go into the grant ether without having somebody else look at it. And again, as I said earlier, make sure you have those lists of really common financial attachments. Your latest 990, your latest audit, your latest certificate of good standing, your IRS letter, your most recent budget. Have those, so you can put your hands on them right there, so you're not scrambling at the last minute. So that's budgets. It's never my strong suit. Cassie usually does this part, so I'll try to answer questions if I can, and hopefully I can. So if there are any questions for that section.
We just had one come in.
Sure.
When it comes to endowments, do you mention it in every grant?
I don't know unless it's asked. Some grants will say, do you have an endowment and what is the value of it? But I don't. Unless it's asked about. You may want to you can always put a notation if you're looking at your audit or your balance sheet. It'll be notated, what your endowment is. But I don't make a big deal about it unless they ask about it.
I usually think of in-kind as donated time or goods. Can you explain in-kind as an expense as referenced on the budget handout?
Yeah, so this is something, it won't apply to all of you, but for example, if I'm writing about a project that's going to happen at the Capitol Center, we would typically charge rent for somebody to use our theater. So I would say, we're not going to charge ourselves rent, but we still have that expense of operating the space. So that's sort of an in-kind expense of whatever the rental fee would be. We're not charging ourselves that rental fee. So it's, it's less clear sometimes. You'll have fewer instances of that than you will of in-kind donations than you will expenses.
Perfect. Those are all the current questions.
Wow, that is great. And again, feel free to try to get in touch with me. Not try. I'm very easy to get in touch with. Get in touch with me afterwards. And if it's a budget question that I can't answer, I'll send you over to Cassie and make her answer it for missing today, leaving me on my own. And then the last piece of the funding cycle is reporting. And I talk a lot about the donation cycle of identifying, cultivating, asking, thanking, and stewarding. And people love to forget the stewarding part of it, the taking care of your donor part. People also love to forget the reporting part of grant writing. I am one of them. I would 100% rather spend my time writing a grant to get me the money than writing a grant saying what I did with the money. So when it comes to procrastinating about reporting, I am the world's worst offender. But it's important, and it's a huge part of the proposal. And just as we think of a thank you as the first step in the next ask with an individual donor, a report is your first step in your next proposal with a funder. So try to stay ahead of the game. Often the reporting requirements will come to you with the grant award. I know the Charitable Foundation does this, the Arts Council does this, the Hearst Foundation does this, Fidelity does this. And so, don't file it away under a stack of papers and forget about it. Write yourself reminders out in your calendar, set yourself notes of when that report will be due. Stay ahead of that deadline, and keep a file of things you want to use when you report on something. We get our school series funded by the Lincoln Financial Foundation, and so we routinely get thank you notes written by kids who have come to school shows at the Capitol Center, and we'll get a packet of notes. I save those. I look through those. I look for good quotes, like the quote that I got from my sponsor today. You want to save those little pieces. Sometimes I'll even just start a Word document in my folder for that funder that's reporting ideas, and just start jotting down, like, things people said to me about the project, or things we learned, or obstacles we encountered, things like that. You want to make sure you're keeping track of your budget, because when you are asked to report in narrative form, you will be asked to report in financial form as well. So, they'll say to you, this is what you said you were going to spend, and what did you really spend? And it's okay that they're not always going to be exactly the same. It's much more important to be honest. I'm a huge proponent of being honest in your reporting. If a project didn't work, tell them that. Tell them what you learned. We thought we could do this, and then it kind of fell apart, and now we know why it fell apart, and here's what we're going to try to do next to make it better. I think it's always more important to be honest about that than to try to make a project look better than it is. If the project was a huge success, by all means, tell them that. Get some good quotes in there, but don't let that piece go. Don't blow that piece off. Well, for one thing, you can't blow that piece off with a lot of funders, or they'll ask for your money back. So you've got to submit those reports, but put the same care and writing in those reports that you would in the proposal, because you're building your profile with this funder. You're building your reputation with this funder. And so they're going to want to see those things. And they'll go back to them. Sometimes they'll go back to a report. And when you're talking about, when you go to them with the next proposal, they might say, oh, I wonder how that last thing, I forgot how that last project worked out. And they'll go back to it and look at it. But reporting also gives your funder really good data and really good demographic data, because your funder, surprise, surprise, often has to report as well. And so, if they're able to say, we funded X number of programs and they reached X number of people, your data is within that. Your data is sitting embedded in their annual reports. So that's where it really becomes a partnership. And that's where, you're sort of hand in glove moving forward through this. So the last thing we'll leave you with, I think we're getting close to our time, and then I can take any final questions if you have them, is just the list of resources that I have, the websites that are really helpful to start your search of, both here in New Hampshire and beyond. I find the Associated Grantmakers site to be a really great one. I love that one. but here in the state, the New Hampshire Humanities, I have to say, do not overlook this organization. I worked there for 7 years, and again, they have money that comes directly from the National Endowment for the Humanities that they have to re-grant. And I've seen some just amazingly innovative projects come out of working with them. So definitely look into what they have to offer, because I think a lot of money stays on the table there sometimes. And the New Hampshire Division of Charitable Trusts is quirky and wacky because there's thousands of these tiny little trusts that some of them aren't active anymore, and some of them are managed by banks, and some of them are managed by law firms. But it's worth a look through to try to see if there's some that work for your organization. They may be geographically specific. One resource that is not on this list because they have no website is the Byrne Foundation, Byrne. And the Byrne Foundation is run by Dorothy Byrne, who lives in Etna, New Hampshire, and I think she's well into her 90s. And they have they are second only to the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation in terms of what they grant out every year. I mean, they grant a phenomenal amount of money. Their primary area of interest is the Upper Valley, but they will often understand if you are based somewhere else, but you draw participation from the Upper Valley. I've defined the Upper Valley fairly loosely in my proposals to them. And it's really just, a 2 to 3 page letter and a good budget. And if she likes you, within 2 weeks, you'll get your check in Dorothy Byrne's handwriting. So definitely think about them. It's an untapped resource in the state.
Hi, Katie.
Yeah.
We have a couple questions in the chat, and I know we're basically out of time, and they're both kind of tied together. And I think that this is a really big and important question. So I was wondering if you could answer it quickly.
I will try.
A quick recommendation for developing a system for grant reporting, like tracking deadlines, etc. Like, how do you keep track of all of those dates?
Yeah. I mean, I honestly use my calendar and Outlook to just set myself reminders. Like I'll set myself a reminder 2 weeks before a report is due, and then a week before. Like I said, the only thing I procrastinate more than writing the actual grant is writing the report. But I also have, I really have my system organized folders for every funder, but I also have a folder that's like common attachments and common requirements. But as something comes across and so within that funder's report, within that funder's folder, you'll see, the 2019 application and the 2018 application. Then within those folders, I always have a folder for the report.
Okay.
And I just throw stuff in there, as it comes.
And then also, I think this is a good question. Is there a too late time frame for reporting? So I think what they're asking is, if you're late, is it better to submit something than to not submit something at all?
Yeah. If you're going to be late, if you know you're going to be late, call your program officer. That's the single best thing you can do. If Cassie were here, she'd be rolling her eyes because I'm routinely late with Cassie's reports to the Arts Council, but I always call her. And usually if you say, can I have another month, they'll give it to you. So that goes back to that honesty and reporting, but yes, don't ever not submit a report. It's always better that they get it late than not at all.
Thank you.
So I think that was it. I thought I saw something. I think that's it for questions. My contact information is there. I wish I could see you all because that's my favorite part of teaching. So thank you all for staring at me for the past hour. Don't hesitate to drop me a line or give me a holler. These are tough times for all of us. That's the one thing I'm going to end with saying is we're all in really uncharted waters right now, and funders are doing their very best to work with us. So keep staying on top of them, keep those relationships strong. Make sure you get funding alerts from the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits. That's a really great email list to sign up for. And we'll all get through it, and we'll get through it on the other side. And next year we can be together in a room. So